Hello and welcome to Week 5 review for AP Environmental Science. Today's topics are Introduction to Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So let's start talking about what we mean when we say biodiversity. So biodiversity refers to the variety of Earth species, the genes they contain, the ecosystems in which they live, and also the ecosystem processes throughout the entire biosphere. Now, normally in apes, when we talk about biodiversity, a lot of the focus is on species diversity. So to be clear, what we mean by species is just a group of individuals that can mate and produce fertile offspring. So if an individual from a population is able to mate with another one and they have offspring that are also able to pass their genes on to the next generation, we would consider that the same species. Now, estimates right now on how many species could potentially be on Earth are around 10 to 14 million. And so far, we've really only identified about 1.9 million. So there's a lot of biodiversity that is still left to discover and identify. So let's talk about those different levels of biodiversity as they exist in the biosphere. Like I said before, the main focus is normally on species diversity. So this would be the number and abundance of species in a particular community or ecosystem or biome. So how many different plant species are there, insects, amphibians, etc. But we also can look within one particular population or maybe one species and consider the genetic diversity that each individual has that might be different from other individuals. So here I've got a picture of some snail shells. These could all be of the same species, but they have a completely different phenotypic expression, meaning there's a lot of genetic variation within the population. And that can be as important as species diversity. There also can be ecological diversity, and we kind of talked about this a little bit in Unit 1. So this is just the variety of ecosystems that can be within a particular area. This could be in a latitude or a state or a particular biome. This also includes things like microclimates. And then there's functional diversity. So this is going to be really important when we start talking about ecosystem services. So the more diverse that an ecosystem or a species or a community is, the functionality of that community is also very diverse. So this is also going to relate back to those biogeochemical cycles that we talked about in Unit 1. So an important figure in AP Environmental Science and also for the concept of biodiversity is a scientist named E.O. Wilson. He is actually a native Alabamian, graduated from the University of Alabama, and has done some very extensive work on biodiversity and ants. The other time that you will see him mentioned is when we start talking about island biogeography. So one important quote for him that I think illustrates the importance of studying biodiversity. Until we get serious about exploring biological diversity, science and humanity at large will be flying blind inside the biosphere. How can we save Earth's life forms from extinction if we don't even know what most of them are? So this also refers back to the fact that we estimate there could be millions of species that we haven't even discovered yet. So how do we usually go about defining species diversity? Because there are a lot of characteristics that a particular population or species can have. So two of the main ways that we do this is by looking at species richness, which is the number of different species found in an ecosystem, and then species evenness. This is the abundance of individuals within each of its species. So let me give you an example. In this community, there are 4 different species of trees, A, B, C, and D. And you can see that within this particular community, there's an even distribution of these species. So 25% of the trees are A species, B species, etc. So this has species richness, but it also has high species evenness. Contrast this with community 2. Community 2 has the same exact number of species, so the richness is equivalent to community 1, but the evenness is very different. We can see that the majority of the community is composed of species A. So that means that there is one species that's very dominant. So this would be two different ways of looking at species diversity. A way that we can actually go out into the field, explore a biome or a community or an ecosystem is using diversity indices. And the two that you will most often run across in AP Environmental Science is the Shannon-Weiner Index and then the Simpson's Index. So the first one is most commonly used in ecological studies, and it will generate a value between 1 and 5. And this number increases as both richness and evenness of the community increase. So typically the higher number that you see, the more biodiverse the community is. So that's one index that really sort of evenly considers both richness and evenness. Simpson's index is a little bit different. It measures the amount of species dominance in a community. So it will generate a number between 0 and 1, and that number is related to the probability that any two individuals that you draw at random from the community belong to different species. So typically, the higher that number, the higher the probability is that those two randomly drawn individuals are different. So you want to see higher numbers on both the indexes here. Now, why would we go about trying to actually quantify biodiversity? One of the important considerations here is for conservation efforts, and you'll learn a lot more about that later on in some other units. But until we can know how much biodiversity is present in an area, we can't really be able to measure whether or not conservation interventions are having an effect. So what are some of the factors that can actually affect the biodiversity of a particular place on Earth? So some of this stuff we talked about previously with just the introduction to the biosphere and ecosystems. So one big factor that determines general biodiversity is latitude. So if you look at this figure here, the relative richness in species is really high around this area here, and that's the equator. So around the equator, there's warm temperatures. The seasons don't have huge temperature shifts. There's a lot of sunlight availability, and that is going to increase things like the net primary productivity. So remember, NPP is the amount of energy that is left over in the food web for all of the consumers. So the more amount of sunlight that you have in an area, higher temperatures, you tend to have higher NPP. So other types of things that are important here are also habitat diversity. So if you've got areas of land that have a lot of topographical features like mountains, rivers, lakes, prairies, all of those things, that's going to allow there to be more ecological niches and more speciation and therefore more biodiversity. One thing that's a little bit interesting is that some small amounts of habitat disturbance actually increase biodiversity, as well as the time period that that particular area has been around. So really, really old places have had more time to generate genetic and species biodiversity than maybe some younger, newly formed areas. So where on Earth are there these concentrations of biodiversity? So we already looked around the equator. That's where you've got the most amount of species. But when we look at species diversity, even within those areas, we can kind of locate these hotspots for biodiversity. So when we're talking about our limited resources for conservation efforts, passing laws and policies to protect biodiversity globally, we want to look out for biodiversity hotspots. So that means that we can utilize our very minimal resources and almost get more bang for our buck, right? We can conserve more species if we concentrate our efforts within these little hotspots here, where we know that we already have high species biodiversity. So biodiversity is not just something that occurs and then is separate from human activities. There are many human activities that can adversely affect biodiversity. And you can remember most of these major types of activities by a little acronym, and I'm going to show you that here in just a second. So probably the most significant human activity that impacts biodiversity is habitat destruction or alteration or fragmentation. So this is when humans go in and say, like in this picture here, completely clear cut a forest or chop up a forest ecosystem into little patches. So if the organisms that live in these ecosystems do not have habitat, they obviously are not going to be able to live, and that's going to, over time, greatly reduce biodiversity. That's probably the number one threat to biodiversity is habitat fragmentation and destruction. The second are invasive species. So these are when you have species that have adapted to a particular area of the world. They are moved to a new area and they proliferate because they have a lack of competition in this new environment. Now, this seems to be something that would just happen naturally, right? Species are in competition with other species. The problem is with invasive species, humans are the ones that are facilitating their movement across the globe with our trade, international flying, all those types of things. So one really particular pest that I know is in our area are these brown stink bugs. So these are originally an Asian species, and nobody really knows exactly how they got here, but they have no natural predators, and so their populations just boom. And they're really annoying to urban areas because in the winter it gets warm and they want to get into your house and they make these really, buzzy sounds, but they're also agricultural pests because they like to penetrate the leaves and the stems to extract the nutrients in the water from the plants, and so they can be a big pest agriculturally. The next human impact is pollution. So this is mostly seen in things like plastics pollution. We create an extreme amount of plastics that get washed into oceans and other parts of the biosphere. We also have pollution from runoff of agricultural areas, dumping of industrial chemicals, oil spills, all types of things. All of that is going to affect the way that organisms function in their environment and potentially reduce biodiversity. The next P in this acronym is for population growth, and this is particular to humans. So many areas that are already under some strain from these other impacts are being further harmed just because of the pressure of human population growth. So as humans grow in numbers, we tend to consume more and more natural resources and move into areas that had been unimpacted by humans previously. And this is pretty much what Unit 3 is going to be all about. So that's going to be an important topic moving forward. So C is for climate change. And climate change, again, that'll be in Unit 9. But in general, as we are shifting the Earth's climate, a lot of species that have evolved to exist at a particular range of tolerance for temperature are having a lot of stress. And one of the main examples of this are corals. So corals exist in a very narrow range of temperature tolerance, and so as the oceans are warming, you have coral bleaching events, and that can be really, really destructive to an area of very high biodiversity in the oceans. The last one is an O, and that's for overexploitation. This is also known as over-harvesting. So when we use forest for wood and other products, clear cutting, that would be overexploiting that ecosystem. Overfishing, so taking more fish out of the ocean than can be sustained through their own reproduction. So how can you remember all of the human activities that impact biodiversity? Well, it's right here, HIPPOC, HIPPCO, and then you will know all of them. So what we're really concerned with biodiversity is the way that these human impacts are drastically reducing populations. So there's a genetic problem, or there's a biodiversity problem when it comes to genetics when we do this. These are called bottleneck events. So in the diagram here, I've got an original population of these little beads. So we can kind of think of each of these little beads as one individual of a population that has its own unique genetic composition. Well, when we drastically reduce a population either through overexploitation, habitat destruction, or anything else, there is a high probability that we are going to lose a good bit of that diversity that was in the species. That
Thanks.
Yes. So one of these things that we're concerned about with drastically reducing populations due to human impact would be these bottleneck events. So picking up here with the huge reduction in the population numbers, it's very possible that we could end up losing some of the genetic variation that is in this population simply by chance, right? So we just completely wiped out a whole bunch of these individuals, and so the surviving population here is always less diverse. So any new population that may rebound will always have less diversity than the original population that it came from. This can be particularly bad if there are some alleles or genetic information here that are deleterious or at a disadvantage. So one interesting example is the American buffalo. So around 1890, they were almost overhunted to extinction, and there were about 12 individuals left. And so all the buffalo that are alive today in America are descended from these 12 individuals. So there may be, thousands of them, but genetically they are very, very similar. And there are some issues with that when it comes to the ability to adapt or withstand new disturbances in the ecosystem. So there are some characteristics of species that make them more prone to extinction. So we can kind of look at this based on the type of niche that each species occupies. So generalist species, those occupy niches that are very broad. So they have many different types of food that they can utilize. They can live in many different places within their ecosystem. And so if they experience a huge disturbance, they can easily move to a new kind of niche. Specialist species, though, are not that fortunate. They have very narrow niches, or they have very specific food sources, or they only live in one particular type of habitat. And so if those habitats are altered or destroyed, then they are more prone to go extinct. So some examples of this would be like the giant panda or spotted owls, tiger salamander. Our generalist species are things that tend to do well in disturbance, like mice, cockroaches, and other types of pests. So species don't just, they're not characterized as just specialist or generalist. This is on a continuum. So the more specialized a species is, the less adaptable it can be in the environment because it's got very, very specialized needs. So for instance, the panda has a very particular food source and habitat. And if those bamboo forests that they use are destroyed, they literally have nowhere else that they can survive. So these organisms are at an advantage when the conditions are more constant. Generalists, however, like I said, they're very adaptable. They can move to a different food source or occupy many different niches. So they have an advantage when conditions change. So if you can imagine, after human alteration of the landscape or if some large impact happens, then our generalist species are going to have no problem coming in and occupying those vacant niches that our specialists had. But the problem here is, again, if we lose these specialists, we're losing biodiversity. So now the question is, why should we even care about preserving biodiversity? Is there any sort of utility to humans in doing so? So in general, more genetically diverse a population is, the better it can respond to environmental stressors. So if environments are consistently being changed or impacted by human activity, the more robust it is genetically, the more likely there will be some organisms that can have some type of adaptation and survive. Ecosystems that have high species richness tend to be productive and sustainable. This is really important considering that humans have to utilize these ecosystems for our own resources, like food. So if we want to continue to have lots of fish in the ocean to eat, if we want to have crops that don't fail due to disease, then we want there to be high species richness. Also, ecosystems that have larger number of species are more likely to recover from disruptions. This is important because so much of the biosphere has already had many human disruptions or even natural disruptions. So we want them to be able to bounce back and recover. So really what biodiversity is vital for is the part of the ecosystems that are our natural capital, the part that humans use to keep us alive and to support our economies. So huge amounts of high biodiversity, that is better for things called ecosystem services. And ecosystem services are those things that humans take advantage of from our natural world. So let's talk about ecosystem services. Used to, you only had to think about this in terms of what is it about the natural world that humans are utilizing. But really the focus needs to be now on categorizing the type of ecosystem service that's being provided. And are sort of the most easy to recognize are these provisioning services. So provisioning services are those ecosystem services that we use for a literal good. So in a forest, we cut down trees in order to have wood and fiber for making paper. We want to extract fuels from the ground, is coal or natural gas or oil. We use water for drinking, irrigation, etc. So what about the ecosystem are we actually using here? That would be a provisioning service. There are also some other types of things that we use ecosystems for that are called cultural services. So these would be things that we do kind of for fun. Anytime you go to the beach and you're enjoying the coast, that would be a recreational thing that you do. That would be a cultural service that the oceans and coastal ecosystems provide. There are aesthetic value to nature as well. We have national forests. People love to go camping. Many different cultural and spiritual identification with things in nature and the natural world are important as well. So then there are the most basic services that support everything else that ecosystems do for us, and we call those supporting services. So this is things like soil formation, nutrient cycling, providing habitats for all living things. And then there are regulating services, and these are becoming more and more important as we are realizing how much of our human impact is reducing ecosystems' ability to provide these services for us. So these are things like climate regulation, flood regulation, and water purification. So why should we take the time to sort of categorize these different ecosystem services? Well, one thing it can do is it can allow us to quantify the value that ecosystems have in an economic way. So here is a breakdown of mangrove swamps sort of value to humans. So mangroves give us timber for building, for heat and food to consume. They help protect inland areas from storm surge, from hurricanes. It filters water. It also is a huge part of indigenous people's fishing practices. That would be a cultural service. And for supporting service, this is where many endangered fish and bird species go for refuge. So now we can kind of see exactly what it is that this ecosystem does. So human activities, of course, are going to disrupt ecosystem services. And I've got two sort of recent examples to illustrate this. So if you remember in 2010, there was that really disastrous BP oil spill in the Gulf. It was spilling out oil for days on end, and there were huge impacts felt around the Gulf because of this. So if we can think of what the ecosystems were doing for us along the coast, Some of the provisioning services here are fisheries and oyster beds. Well, after this oil spill happened, those fisheries and oyster beds were unusable. And so the people that relied on those provisioning services for a living, for economic stability, was completely gone. Many, many different tourist and vacation industries along the coast had to close because the beaches and the coast were closed. And so those cultural services that were provided by those ecosystems were completely disrupted. And what this usually means for people is a loss of economic, economic gain there. So people lose jobs, and it's overall just a bad situation. Now, another interesting example of this is the horrible floods that happened in Houston after Hurricane Harvey. Well, they happen a lot, but Hurricane Harvey was particularly bad. And if you remember, that happened in 2017. So Houston had this really terrible flooding, and it's partly because some of the regulating services of that ecosystem where Houston has been built was sort of disrupted by human activities. So Houston has a lot of urban sprawl, so there was a lot of paved streets, and if you have all that hard concrete, then there's nowhere for the water to go. And around Houston, there had also been a significant reduction in the amount of wetlands. So like up to 70% of their wetlands had been completely filled in. And so if you think about what wetlands do for us, is that they absorb water. And so when they were gone, this sort of led to massive flooding. So anytime humans disrupt ecosystem services, it always sort of comes back to us in some economic way. So let's get into some practice questions. Question 1, which of the following is most likely to be the direct result of lack of genetic diversity in a food crop such as corn? So remember, we were talking about genetic diversity as being important to populations' ability to resist changing ecosystems or another threat to them, like disease or disruption to the ecosystem. So would they have decreased kernel size, decreased potential yield, increased susceptibility on plant disease, or increased resistance to pests? So if you are lowering genetic diversity, odds are you have increased the susceptibility of this crop to plant disease. This is also something that we have problems with monocultures. So having a crop that is almost genetically identical. Which of the following can be used to assess the biological diversity of an area? Population size of each species and area occupied by each population, minimum population area and minimum viable population size, number of individuals under 15 years old and number of individuals over 65 years old, and genetic variation within each species and number of species present. So we want to assess diversity. So that means we need to either look at the variety of species, variety of genes, variety of ecosystems. So population size and the area occupied isn't as important. The age of the organisms are also not as important. So now we have minimum population area and minimum viable population size versus genetic variation within each species and number of species present. So of those two, D is the best choice. Biologists are alarmed by the continued spread of white nose syndrome in bats. White nose syndrome is a fungal disease that is decimating bat populations across eastern North American forests, with mortality rates reaching up to 100% at many sites. Some scientists suggest that even if the impact of white nose syndrome on bat population can be reduced and the extinction of the species avoided, the bat populations are likely to remain alarmingly small. Which of the following is not a threat to the survival of the bat species if the total number of bats becomes very small? So here we're talking about a reduction in bat population size. So this sounds like a population bottleneck. So we know that when that happens, we tend to have decreased genetic variation. So let's look at the answer choices. A, decreased susceptibility to new diseases because of a decrease in genetic variation. B, difficulty finding mates when populations are small. C, increased vulnerability to environmental disturbances. D, competition from other species with a similar niche. So 3 of these are definite threats to a small population of survivors. They will definitely have difficulty finding mates. They will be more vulnerable to environmental disturbances, and competition from other species will be more intense, but they will not have a decreased susceptibility to new disease. So the answer is A. Which of the following would be considered a provisioning ecosystem service given by forests? So we have to kind of remember what we mean by a provisioning ecosystem before we look at the answer choices. So provisioning services would be those that give humans a material good. So carbon is removed from the atmosphere by trees to help limit the magnitude of atmospheric greenhouse effect. Forests influence the local microclimate, affecting humans because of changes in temperature, shade, UV radiation, and windbreaks. Forests maintain watershed integrity by controlling floods. Many products such as glue, rubber, and medicines are produced with forest products. That sounds right. That would be a provisioning ecosystem service. A, that would be a supporting service. B would also be a supporting service. And C would be a regulating service. Question 5. Which of the following describes 2 characteristics shared by ecosystems that have high biodiversity? Large number of different species and complex food webs, lower genetic diversity and abundant resources, variety of ecological roles and niches and populations above carrying capacity, large number of individuals of different species, and simple food chains. So let's talk about the characteristics of ecosystems with high biodiversity. They tend to have lots of productivity, they're more complex, and have a lot of different species. So of the choices, definitely they do not have lower genetic diversity. Populations above carrying capacity, that wouldn't really be a descriptive thing about either high or low biodiversity. That's more of a population characteristic. And they definitely wouldn't have simple food chains. So a large number of different species and complex food webs would be in areas with high biodiversity. The vermilion darter, an endangered fish species found in only one county in Alabama, has experienced massive habitat loss due to human activity in the area. If the population were to decrease to only a few surviving individuals, any future population would be descended from only those few fish. Which of the following is best illustrated in this potential scenario of the vermilion darter? So you only have a few surviving individuals here, and it's asking you what would happen if you ended up with a larger population that is descended from only these few fish. Well, that sounds a lot like the case with the American buffalo. So what are the answer choices? Carrying capacity, population bottleneck, natural selection, or local extinction? Definitely a population bottleneck. But I also want to address the answer choice that is D. So one thing about apes that's very, very important is how you use the word extinction. So if you write in a free response question that a species has gone extinct, the reader is going to assume that you mean that every single individual of that species on planet Earth is gone. If you mean that the species is no longer located in a particular area because of a human impact or something else, you want to say locally extinct. That would be okay. Question 7. Which of the following would be considered a supporting ecosystem service given by the oceans? So again, what does it mean when we say supporting? Those would be those things that underpin all other ecosystem services. A, oceans provide oxygen from primary productivity of algae and phytoplankton. B, coastal areas are used as centers of recreation, providing many jobs to the local population. C, fisheries provide fish and other edible products. D, cities and towns near the ocean have more moderate climates due to their proximity to the water. So of all of these things, which sounds like it's basically vital to everything else that's happening in the ecosystem? That's going to be oxygen production. Now, B is an ecosystem service, but it's a cultural service. C, that is a provisioning service. And D, that is a regulating service. So let's get into practice-free response. European honeybees are in trouble. Many valuable food crops are dependent on pollination by honeybees, yet the number of managed honeybee colonies has dropped significantly since the 1970s due to colony collapse disorder, which is characterized by the sudden disappearance of all the worker bees in a colony. Recent scientific research suggests that many stress factors of anthropogenic origin are the culprits in CCD. Some farmers are trying to use fewer colonies to pollinate their crops. Some are hoping that other natural pollinators, like wild bees and other insects, will do the job of pollination for them. A, as stated above, the number of managed honeybee colonies has dropped significantly over the past few decades. Describe 2 specific economic consequences of the collapse of the managed honeybee colonies. B, pollination by native insects is considered an ecosystem service. Identify a different ecosystem service and explain how that service benefits human society. So before we start looking at each part, let's make sure that we kind of understand what's happening here. We know that these colonies are vital to one particular activity of humans, and that is crop pollination. So without crop pollination, you have decreased productivity, not as much food production, and possible economic consequences from the reduction in food. So let's look at A. You would get 1 point for the consequence linked to a description. And note, it's really important that you only write the 2 answers that you believe are going to get you the point, because only the first 2 answers are scored. So if you don't pay attention to this particular part of the instructions, you could potentially miss points here by not writing about the economic consequences that that you have more confidence in getting a point. So what could you have said here? One economic consequence would be increased costs or prices. And the description here would be particular for the food crops themselves. So if you have a reduction in the food that's being produced because you don't have enough pollinators, then that's going to increase the cost of growing food and therefore increase the price of food for consumers. It's also going to do this for the beekeeper services and replacement of their hives. It's going to increase cost and prices for the food because you may have to rely on manual pollination. You may have to invest in attracting other native pollinators or by providing, nesting sites or safe foraging areas for those things. And you also could have talked about lower revenue or sales or a loss of jobs related to these agricultural practices. So you would have lower revenue and sales because you just overall have less crops to sell. The yields are lower. You also could have a loss of jobs because you don't have as much honey being produced, which is in and of itself an economic consequence. So the important thing here is just to make sure that you are linking the consequence to a description. You would not have gotten the point if you had just said, well, food is going to cost more. You have to link it to why. So B, this was about the ecosystem service. Now they already give you the information that pollination is considered a service. They want you to identify a different one, and this could have been anything. The list was really long. And so what I want to focus on is how exactly you would have gotten the point for doing this. So you would have gotten 1 point for the service linked to an explanation of the actual benefit, right? Because you have to explain how the service benefits human society. So one thing that ecosystems do for us is control pests with natural predators. This is going to reduce the need for us to use things that are expensive, like pesticides, And it's also going to reduce crop loss due to pest infestations. You also could have talked about kind of things that we talked about with that mangrove swamp, filtering and purification of water by soil and plants. This reduces the cost of us having to make our drinking water safe by artificial means of purification. And this also reduces health issues because we have less contamination and fewer waterborne diseases. So if you notice how this rubric is set up, it's not enough just to identify, you have to also be able to link it to the particular benefit. So always, always, always make sure that you are doing both things if they say identify and explain. Very important. All right, so really quickly, I have one more, and this is about aspects of species that could make them more prone to extinction. So species such as the dusky seaside sparrow, the passenger pigeon, and the woolly mammoth are extinct. Populations of other species have declined to the point where they are designated as threatened or endangered. So A, describe 3 characteristics of organisms that would make them particularly vulnerable to extinction, and B, present 3 arguments in favor of the maintenance of biodiversity. So let's take a look at A. You could have gotten 3 points here because they want you to describe those three characteristics of organisms. Anything that we discussed earlier would have been fine here, but also I want you to look at the way that this rubric is written. Each characteristic must be clearly described, explained, or a specific answer or example must be provided. So it would not have been enough to simply say that species that are vulnerable to extinction are case strategists. You have to actually describe what this is. It wouldn't have been enough to say that species that have low reproductive rates are more vulnerable. You have to actually describe what that means. So you could have gotten a point if you said that species are more vulnerable to extinction if they have low reproductive rates, because those low rates make it less likely that they can rebound in population size after they have been, after habitat destruction or they've been overexploited. So always make sure that you are doing a really good job of the description and not just identifying. B, present 3 arguments in favor of the maintenance of biodiversity. So remember what an argument kind of consists of, right? So you're first making, a claim about something, and then you're providing some evidence, and then the reasoning as to why that supports your claim. So you can say, well, we should maintain biodiversity because there are potential future medical resources that could be found. If we don't have this biodiversity, then we could lose out on curing cancer or finding some other type of medical resource that could benefit humans' quality of life. So again, you can't just identify, you've got to go through the entire process of making a claim and then using reasoning to sort of support it. All right, that is it for week 5.